Thank you, Tom, and welcome to the Azcende Dialogue, where we talk all things national security, defence, and of course, technology, geopolitics along the way. So I'm here with Tom Loveard, is that the pronunciation?
Sure.
CTO and sort of co-founder of C2 Robotics. So I'm really keen to hear all about the UUV space, but also in terms of what you are doing and how things are tracking. So I think we'll launch straight into it. And the first question I always ask is, tell me a little bit about you, or tell us a little bit about yourself, about C2 Robotics and the industry that you're working in.
Great. Okay. So I guess for me personally, I've been sort of in and around defence innovation and autonomous systems for more than 20 years now. I guess I did my PhD at RMIT in artificial intelligence and machine learning way back in the early 2000s when nobody thought AI was going to do anything meaningful. And kind of there were no jobs in AI at the end of that because no one had any sort of real goals. So myself and another PhD sort of decided, okay, let's go and start a computer vision AI company. And that was sort of the beginning of my my time where we started to work in the defence and national security space and the particularly in the autonomous system space, which at that time with the airborne systems was really just starting to take off. So I guess the three founders, core founders of C2 Robotics, has been through multiple startups over the past, all been quite successful, and have been sort of, I guess, some of the great success stories of Australian research and development that's gone on to be acquired and be used by our military and by defence forces and a lot of prime integrators and things like that. So I guess we've been around and we know the scene pretty well. Throughout, a lot of pain and suffering over the years. But I think C2 Robotics was our goal and our vision to do things a little bit differently. I guess we're fortunate enough to be in a position where we didn't have the financial constraints that all our previous endeavours have had, and we're able to really sort of look at the vision and the idea of what do we think is the critical technologies and processes and ways of working that are going to be really important in the future. And what we saw and what we sort of wanted to disrupt was, this robotics and autonomous system space, it needs to move faster. We saw sort of a lot of the major programs we're still following a sort of more traditional defence approach where you took a long time, years to go through your requirements and sort of just, selection process. You took more years to build capability. And I think things, like big UAS programs, like you look at Triton and stuff like that, classic example where it's taking decades to do these things. And we're like, if that's what robotics and autonomous systems is like, we need to shake that up because we think that fundamentally there's a great opportunity to do things faster, to do things cheaper and do it in a way that is going to be, achieve better outcomes for our defence forces. So I think that was the vision, and we started. C2 Robotics, kind of was founded in the sort of second half of 2020. We spent a lot of time in lockdown thinking about things, but ultimately what we came up with was, here's some things, pieces of the technology that we think are critical to our future, and these sort of long-range, large underwater autonomous vessels were one that we saw there was a big niche and something that, even though there was no stated requirement from our Defence Force and Navy to say, hey, we want these, we kind of said, look, we want to build this. We think it's going to be a requirement, and lo and behold, it's turned out to be pretty prescient.
Wow. So, so if I get this right, C2 Robotics has been around since 2020, but as a team, as a founding team, this is not obviously your first company together.
Correct, that's right. Yeah. So the three founders have worked together in multiple previous ventures. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, thanks for the background. That's fascinating. And I guess the space that you're working in, like you said, when you started, obviously there wasn't a demand signal, or wasn't a set of requirements from the ADF or any other sort of organizations around the world. So why, I guess, UUVs? And before we go into that, the historical background, most people know it from research submersibles, etc. But give us a bit of background on that and its potential dual use sort of potential.
Great. So from our point of view, even within the defence space, UUVs have been really traditionally seen as something that's a close-in support asset for a ship, or doing a job of a diver, or sort of these sort of mine countermeasures and things where you've got a ship that's close by, you're operating close to the ship, you're under almost constant surveillance and things like that, constant operation of this mothership that's with you. And I think there were a few companies that we saw who were sort of trying to push the boundaries in that to do things with large UUVs, and we're like, wow, that's really, really interesting because obviously here, a lot of our background was in airborne, UAS space. And it was one thing that we're like, okay, that's all well and good, but, most of these things have limited range. And if you want to make them low cost and have high effect, then it tends to be that they get smaller and the range drops down. And having done a bit of research and looking at the marketplace and what we thought was technically feasible, the view was that these large underwater systems that our vessel is our Speartooth system is anywhere from sort of 8 to 11 meters in different variants of it. In that larger size, you can actually achieve some really, really interesting outcomes with how far these things can go, and that's in the maritime domain is a space where Australia really needs to have that range. We've got these huge distances, and what we didn't see happening in the rest of the world was doing it at a cost point that could enable lots of these things to be used. I think what we saw were these very, very high-end research capabilities that ultimately, you'd expect them to last for 20 years and be used for very, very, broad range of missions. Whereas I think what we saw was, okay, we want to engineer something that's much more on the very high volume, but potentially could be used in multiple situations where you may not get it back again. And in that situation, it needs to be cost effective. So, so that was sort of really the design remit that we set ourselves. And I think, it's, seeing the problems that Australia has with how do we cover this huge amount of ocean with very limited ships, existing, surface fleet, our existing subsurface fleet, So as you say, the traditional UUVs really were seen as working with a ship, whereas we wanted to break that barrier and say, look, if you don't rely on your ship and you've got enough intrinsic range in your platform, you can unlock all these really interesting outcomes that suddenly you may not need to send a ship that you once might have.
So in terms of the types of missions or use cases that, let's say, Speartooth can do, can you give us some examples, from that dual use perspective?
We really try to not be, prescribe the use cases, because ultimately we see our platform is an underwater truck. So it's got a great big payload bay in the middle of it. That payload bay is largely empty, and the customer can place inside that payload bay whatever they would like to do. So I guess, there's a range of payloads that our defence forces have, been quite interested in. I can't really talk too much to those at this point, but, they're in quite a variety of different spaces. So I think from our point of view, anything that requires a long range system to be able to, take something in a very covert manner, and that could be anywhere from, payloads that, take the power from our system and then, sort of are persistent, data collection, things to delivery of, whatever potential options. There's a very broad range of things that essentially can fit within that payload bay.
Okay. And what is the distance we're talking about in terms of Speartooth is capable of?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on the variant, and I and not really at liberty to sort of give exact numbers, but we're talking sort of thousands of kilometers sort of numbers. So
wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, I get the I guess the metaphor of an underwater truck, right? Because as we all know, trucks, you can basically you take it, you get it as a platform, then you retrofit it and use it in terms of how you see fit. So it's fantastic approach.
Yeah, and it makes it a very adaptable platform as well, because there may be use cases that our customers have in their head today but tomorrow some other company might come up with some completely innovative, package for us to carry. And then immediately it can then become a carrier for that package. Yeah.
So, and this is a bit of a question that's related to it. So, it's people know a lot about Anduril because they've been in the news, etc. Now, your platform is almost complementary to that, not really directly competitor. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how the two sort of work together or how they're complementary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the Ghost Shark, to my understanding, is the much bigger platform. It's I think there's an analogy that I've heard that I think is really appropriate is, if you think about it in terms of airlift capability, if you're stuck with one system, you can choose a C-17 or a C-130 or a Black Hawk.
Yes.
All three of those things does military airlift, but they do it for very, very different outcomes in very different scenarios. And I think the size and the cost of the platforms are such that they complement each other. A Black Hawk and a C-130 don't compete against each other because the person who needs this is not going to use it for that. So I think that's exactly how I see the complementarity of the Ghost Shark and the Speartooth. Is that the Ghost Shark is able to carry much larger, much more high cost payloads, and I think that ours will be things that ultimately can be put in a lot more harm's way. So I think that there will be mission sets that you may be quite happy to lose a Speartooth that you would never want to lose a Ghost Shark. So I think that's sort of where the two complement each other. Yeah.
Understood. Okay, I guess it's a good segue into the question around defence, which is obviously is a heavy sort of defence use case there. A lot of the startups I talk to in national security, one of the biggest bugbears they have is obviously cracking the defence market. Now you've obviously done this before, so I guess it's a little bit easier. But what has been your experience in terms of winning that contract, or even getting a pilot or something done with the Australian Defence Force?
Yeah. So I think over looking at the past as how our previous companies and also C2 Robotics has got to where we have, I think Australia has actually got a fairly interesting innovation program, and I think that's worked well in all previous cases where there has been reasonable innovation funding for my first company. There were two of us who came out of our PhDs and we had bright ideas and we developed some prototypes, off our own back. But, there were programs at that point. It was the CTD program that became the Defence Innovation Hub program that, you didn't have to be a giant player with, huge backing. You could be a tiny 2-person startup with a good idea. And ultimately, those innovation programs were available and fit for, sort of fostering that initial stage. But I think where the big problem and the big challenge came was bridging the gap between that world and where the actual real money is in defence, which is where, major program procurement happened. And I think in the past, really the only avenue to sort of crossing that bridge was to jump on board with the primes. The primes owned all of the major programs and as a minor, small company, if you could convince the primes that, what you had was useful and valid for their platform or their system, was something that added value to that ecosystem that they were providing, then that was the way in which you were able to find an avenue to, where the larger procurement outcomes resulted. So I think, that's one where I think Australia, probably it had been very challenging to cross that bridge. I think, it's our experience has been that, if you were able to do that in somewhere like the US, then, all the major primes would be either US or European primes. If you're able to get into those systems in the US, regardless, it was almost a no-brainer then to come back and get into the Australian systems, but to try and do it through the Australian systems, then into the international ecosystem of those primes didn't really flow the same way. So I think that was where some of the big challenges of how do you break through those barriers from the innovation ecosystem where you've got a product that might be, you can take it out, you can field it, you can show that it does what you said it's going to do.
Yeah.
But how do you actually get that into the hands of users and acquired in the sort of numbers that makes the return on investment worthwhile?
Yes,
and that's something that is really hard to do. So, and I think that, ultimately we hopefully can do better. So,
yeah, look, I mean, that defense primes who own the contracts, the big contracts into defense, and then smaller companies, sort of marrying up with them or partnering with them, that's a well-trodden path, right? And I guess the question to you as someone who's done this multiple times now, from an Australian perspective in terms of delivering best outcomes, is that the best way, or is there a way for defence that needs to develop to become more experimentation focused? Take a few more risks.
I think it depends on what you're talking about. So I think 100 class frigates and nuclear submarines. I think that's the primes game all day long. So there's no way C2 Robotics is going to build a 100 class frigate. But I think when we talk about you look at the world right now, much of the current leading edge military technology is not in the big ticket items. It's in these small smart mini systems. The Ukraine right now is facing a naval battle against Russia in the Red Sea and in the Black Sea. And the people who are winning are not the people with frigates and submarines. They're the people with drones and missiles. So Ukraine currently has no ships that I'm aware of. So I think that does change the equation a lot compared to how the traditional mechanisms and acquisition programs may have been. Whether that flows through to be reflected in our defence procurement systems will be interesting to see. But I certainly think that the ability for a small Australian company to fully develop a platform that meets some very, very critical requirements of our defence capability is now a possibility that maybe wasn't the case in the past. And I think that raises some exciting possibilities. But then it does change some mindsets about, well, how do we better change our acquisition and procurement systems to take advantage of the fact that warfare has changed dramatically in terms of the kinds of systems we need to win. So
and look, I've read, I'm sure but there's so much out there in terms of what's being written as perhaps that long procurement cycle isn't conducive to responding to new threats, right? Like you look at what's happening in the Red Sea at the moment with the Houthis, almost like daily in terms of trying to fly suicide drones or one-way drones into shipping, whether it be warships or whether it be shipping goods or services, etc. And at the moment, there seems to be, the US and its allies that are operating that area, there seems to be no mitigation other than down them with very expensive missiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Where the asymmetric threats, in many cases, even though those Houthi drones aren't necessarily getting through, in some ways they're winning because they're basically depleting the stocks of these incredibly valuable and you can't procure those kind of systems in the kind of volumes and at the speed to replace them compared to the targets. And I think likewise in the Ukraine conflict, the tactics and the systems have changed dramatically from the start of that conflict. Every couple of months you see almost an iteration and change in the tactics of what's working and what's what technologies are appropriate for today. So I think anyone who's talking about, well, let's acquire the technology today that we need in 5 years or 10 years, what you need to acquire is adaptability, in my view. So
got it. Brilliant. Fantastic. Oh, well, let's switch gears now and talk about, and we mentioned innovation about 10 minutes ago. I find innovation is always it's hard to measure, hard to sort of quantify. But I mean, this is your third company. You've I believe that even at one stage you were headquartered in the US, or you were operating in the US.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So in your view, right? What is in trying to compare the ecosystems, the Australian versus what's happening in the US, the EU, etc. How would you compare Australia from an innovation perspective up against the global markets?
So I think in terms of actual innovation, capacity, I think Australia has phenomenal, ability to innovate and produce great technologies and products. I've seen not just from tech companies I've been involved in, but across the board, there's a really, really great, ecosystem of people with great ideas and great ability to actually make those ideas real things. Where I think Australia has differed a lot, and I think, not just even, across the US and EU, but, if we look at much smaller players like, Israel, Turkey, South Korea, these even the Nordic states, people, these are countries that have really quite deep, defense, supply chains that, supply the global industry, where I think across the board, whether it's the US or Turkey or Israel, what I think is potentially different is that Australia, in my view, hasn't had the urgency to to have our own technology and our own systems, and that there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we've always been able to go to the US and buy what we needed. Maybe someone like Turkey might not have such assurance of access to those kind of things, but we also haven't really seen in our environment, our part of the world's been a pretty stable and friendly place for a long time. So I think it's one of those things where suddenly now the Indo-Pacific is looking a lot different to what we thought it looked like 5 years ago. So I think that urgency of, hey, we need our own reliance on our own industry. We always had the US that we could just go to and buy what we needed. And I guess there was always a mentality that, hey, if this has come from an Australian company, well, why aren't the US doing it? Can it really be that good?
Yes.
And I think that's just a part of not having, it's a chicken and egg problem. If you don't have a defense industry that's used to, that the customer is used to buying from, then when they look at buying from that, it's not a mature ecosystem. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas when, in my past experience of going to the US, when their users see an innovative product, they've got a much more open mind that says, hey, if I haven't seen that, then it's top leading edge stuff, because I've seen everything that's out there. And I know that I haven't seen that, and that looks pretty good to me. So I guess there's a risk appetite and that confidence level that, certainly in the US, hey, if our industry can't provide it, then there's, of course, our industry is the top of the world. So they just have that faith and that trust in their own industry. And I guess someone like Turkey, you look at the, pretty impressive outcome of defense innovation in Turkey. Both the two factors of, hey, we've got a near and present threat of, living in a pretty, hostile neighborhood, and also, hey, we're not guaranteed of having surety of supply from elsewhere. So there's that pressure to actually look to your own industries and your own development. And I think Australia hopefully should be realizing, with all the supply chain issues that happened in COVID, that I think that's a pathway that Australia needs to start taking a lot more seriously than we potentially had done in the past. And I think that's where our innovation ecosystem hasn't really pulled through. And in the past, that's why it was always like, great, develop innovation product in Australia, but go to the US and Europe to sell it, basically.
Yes. Okay, look, last question is related to what we've just talked about, is that you're right, the Indo-Pacific has become busy, let's put it that way, and looks to become even more busier over the next, even short term. Predictions are anywhere from like 5 to 15 years. Now, obviously, Australia is not going to, from a naval perspective, build a navy the size of, let's say, China, right, or even a fraction of that size. So what can we do using technology, autonomous systems, underwater uncrewed vehicles? What do you think Australia can do to at least uplift our capability from a naval perspective?
Yeah, so I think, I guess broadly, I'm going to be pretty biased because, obviously we develop UUV systems, but I think the reason we started developing UUV systems, these long range, high endurance, multi-payload, payload agnostic systems for this underwater space, was that we did believe that there's an opportunity to provide Australia with, some real capability that they won't be getting. And I think, whatever the threat profile might look like, I think what the current world is showing us is that uncertainty is almost, is going to be baked in. So what the world looks like even in 1 year from now, hey, a new US election could result in a very isolationist US policy. And what does that mean across the entire Indo-Pacific? We don't know what that looks like. So I think, within very, very short timeframes, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's where, reliance on these really huge, mega projects essentially that are, even our current fleet of, Anzacs and AWDs and, submarines, the Collins class, if we need to adapt our capability to some changing circumstance, those platforms are really, really hard to change. And our future platforms are just not going to be available in the timeframes that really matter. So I think that's where these, asymmetric systems and particularly autonomous systems, we've got a very small defence force with very small amount of people. We need to do, things that aren't going to really draw resources. And so for me, when I look at Speartooth, when I look at things like the Blue Bottle, Ghost Shark, and various other things, we have fortuitously, I think, got a great ecosystem, particularly in the naval space, for long-range autonomy. And I think that these platforms are developing and have been developed to, particularly, Oceus have done an incredible job of the Blue Bottle is a very mature capability. I think Speartooth is coming very close to being, at that it's ready to go. So so I think that it's I think a great opportunity for Australia to have, naval capability that allows us to do things and have options as circumstances change and as, our environment and our region changes to adapt rapidly to whatever those changes might be. So, and I think Speartooth, the fact that we can integrate a new payload in weeks if we have to.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Yeah, that's impressive.
And what that payload might be, we can change our mission sets, and there's so many things that in the past, trying to put a new sensor into a UAV that's built by a prime, that's a multi-year, very complex endeavor. We tried to build everything in a way that's, hey, here's an easy system. It's got open architecture. It allows adaptability and flexibility. And I think that that's one area where small players like C2 can really provide benefit to our Navy to solve a lot of these problems. I know you have to go very far to find an article criticising Australian Navy or Defence, but why are we doing that? Or why didn't we, look at how long it's going to do, look how expensive all these programs are going to do. But I think autonomous systems is a fantastic good news story that we have to tell in this country. But I think it's also, one of those things that we have to move beyond just R&D as well. So we have to be able to do these things for real. So
get into production.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's all the questions that I had. Thank you, Tom. That was a really interesting and sort of insightful conversation. Would love to keep tabs in terms of what you guys are doing, C2 Robotics, into the future. But thank you for your time and lovely talking to you.